Good morning. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm extremely excited this morning to be here with everyone to talk about how the homes that we build are not the homes that communities need. My name is Tracy Lowe, and I'm a fellow at the Metropolitan Policy Program of the Brookings Institution at the Ann T. and Robert M. Bass Center for Transformative Placemaking. I am really excited today to be joined by two panelists who, after I take the time to share with you a little bit about my research on housing, we'll have a chance to discuss why we're in this situation where we have this mismatch between what we're building and what we actually need. Today, I'm going to be joined by Councilmember Cam Gordon, who represents Ward 2 on the Minneapolis City Council. Minneapolis has recently enacted a number of very exciting housing reforms on the regulatory side, and Councilmember Gordon has been deeply involved in these efforts. He has lived in Minneapolis since 1977, where he graduated from high school, and he's also a graduate of the University of Minnesota. He helped found the Minnesota Green Party and is currently the council's sole Green Party member. He also served on the board of the Minneapolis Center for Neighborhoods, and so he has been engaged in these issues of what it takes to create and sustain healthy neighborhoods that work for people for many years. He's also worked for decades as a teacher. And so with Councilmember Gordon, we basically have a Mr. Rogers here to join us today to help us understand what it's going to take to create the neighborhoods that we need for the next generation. I'm also joined today by Ed Faustin from Area Probe. Ed has had a multi-decade career in doing the hard work behind the scenes that it actually takes to build new construction projects. He's worked at a major national bank in real estate finance at PNC, and he was also the vice president of the Strategic Investments Group at the New York Economic Development Corporation. With Area Probe today, he does real estate advisory services that's around helping his clients understand what the market and demand for new real estate product is, as well as what it's going to take to finance and raise capital to get those projects done. So let's get into it. I'd like to talk a little bit, do a little bit of level setting about what's going on in the real estate market now and what some of the long-term trends have been that have led us to the moment that we're in today. So first, we all just who are here survived 2020. And so, we're familiar with the fact that it was a tough year for a lot of people and for the country. We're seeing the coronavirus pandemic shift demand across real estate products. And we're starting to understand that some of those shifts are going to be long-term. The economic downturn resulting from the pandemic is hurting players at all levels within the real estate ecosystem, whether it's tenants or landlords. Finally, we have a new awareness that white supremacy in the United States is still alive and well. And we're hearing from the Black Lives Matter movement a loud and widespread call for progress on racial justice. And finally, in 2020 and in this first half of 2021, we've seen a number of climate change-related disasters that are escalating in cost and impact on the built environment. This is a convergence that we need to turn into an opening to reset and reimagine. The real estate industry needs to recognize that we have a need to create more walkable, transit-oriented, and mixed-income communities for people and places, that there are benefits to creating these kinds of communities of opportunity, and that that real estate, including both the public and the private sector, have an important role to play in achieving these outcomes. Today, we're going to talk about three distinct trends that are coming together in order to produce this mismatch between housing demand and housing supply. All of these trends together have big implications for the future. And right now, along the three dimensions I'm showing here, we have this paradox where there's more demand than ever, and yet the buildings and the places, the inventory that we have, don't match the rapidly changing business models, demographics, and climate pressures that we're under. It's a somewhat crazy situation that presents both an imperative and an opportunity for real estate leaders and policymakers to work together towards creating a built environment that works better for more people, businesses, and communities. And so that's why we have Cam and Ed here today to talk about how to do just that. When we say the real estate industry, we're talking not just about builders, but really a large ecosystem that includes public, private, and nonprofit actors, all working together in order to stand up structures. There's a growing sense in many US communities that we're building the wrong things in the wrong places for the wrong people. But the real estate industry is really large and complex. So it's tricky to interrogate why this is happening and who is responsible for doing something about it. So let's use the hour that we have today with Cam and Ed to deconstruct what's going on and to push the conversation forward into housing innovation. Let's start with demographic change and shifting living patterns. So I'll just share a little bit of data here. What we see on this graph is the US millennial generation, that is Americans who are currently age 23 through age 38. And with this generation, we see that we are not forming the same household arrangements as our predecessors. Where when the boomers were graduating from college, by far the dominant household arrangement was a married couple, two spouses with at least one child. That was almost 70% of the population in 1968. Today, that's less than a third of millennials. And so that's a dramatic shift. Millennials have redistributed their household arrangements into a variety of other kinds of household arrangements, whether it's living alone or living with their parents or simply not having children. At the same time, our housing inventory has remained largely stagnant. So the kinds of houses that we have for these households to live in has not changed over that same time period. Unfortunately, the one change that has happened is that the share of national housing inventory that is composed of single-family homes with 4 or more bedrooms, that is the only kind of product that has increased in terms of its share in our national inventory. And in fact, smaller units that might be a better fit for millennial households actually comprise a lower share of nationwide housing inventory today as compared to 1980. So now I'd like to hand it over to our discussants, and let's start with we can keep this graph up here, but can we start with Ed? And Ed, can you tell me, just when you look at this graph, what do you see?
It's fascinating. It's interesting because what we see is more or less what you've kind of pointed out, but yet there's something that seems to be missing. So clearly, on one hand, there's a large demand for 3 to 4 bedroom units to a certain degree. We talk so much about some of the trends of millennials ages 25 to 38, most of whom are delaying marriage, using public transportation, dining out, more often, cooking less, prioritizing travel. We even have empty nesters as well to a certain degree who are a part of this downsizing trend. But what's interesting is that the National Multifamily Housing Council points out that 52% of households are comprised of couples with children, domestic partners, blended families, larger generational families who really need that 3 to 4 bedroom sort of size. So there's something that's missing, in my opinion, in terms of understanding sort of the real reality with regards to how we're building for all the groups that are in need. There's a point I think we're going to reach where there's only so much overcrowding that we can do. So on one hand, we certainly have trends for millennials that are in need of such a smaller finite amount of space. In fact, over the last 10 to 12 years, I think there are a couple of property management firms who've averaged that the average unit size has decreased from nearly 1,000 square feet for units and apartments to about, I think it's about 940. So they've been trying to accommodate for this shift, but even with that shift, as they've brought in new inventory that's smaller, at that same time, there are still some of these larger families that are looking to, basically take a flight to quality and are having to settle for two-bedroom units with the 2 or 3 kids. And I think for many of us, especially in major cities like New York, it's a challenge. And it was even more interesting. There was an article that showed that in the South Bronx from 2010 to 2017, an American Community Survey had pointed out that the area had lost about somewhere around 400 units with 3 or 4 more bedrooms. Yet you have a number of families that are well beyond that sort of median 2.5 to 3 person household. And about the city as a whole around that same time period lost about 23,000 apartments with 4 bedrooms or more. So there's a little bit of a mismatch here, and it's certainly something that we need to address. There are developers, some of our clients, who are certainly looking into that, especially on the affordable side, acknowledging that some of the average sizes for these households are in need of that sort of size requirement. So there certainly is a mismatch. There is some acknowledgement of that, but we can't correct it soon enough.
Okay, let's go to Councilmember Gordon. Cam, can you give us some feedback on how what I've shared so far lands in Minneapolis? How does this resonate with the neighborhoods that you represent?
Well, I think it resonates well. There's clearly a problem here. I think it's tied to the economy and the growing wealth gap as well. So we'll see people who don't have a very large family, but they have a lot of money, and they'll tend to buy the larger home with extra bedrooms, and maybe they can have an office and a game room and other things happening there. And as more and more people want to move into Minneapolis, houses get more expensive. And this will make it a lot harder with a family that it doesn't make that much money and they have a lot of children to find a place to live. So we definitely see this. We try to push our affordable housing dollars and public investment towards family oriented housing with 3-4 bedrooms, but also those are much more expensive to build. We can get many more units built if we're building smaller units. So and then I think we can also see that if you're an investor and you're trying to make a profit off it, if you can build many smaller, very expensive units, you're actually doing better financially than if you're building just 1 or 2 larger units that you still can't probably get that much money for. So we're seeing a lot of that, especially kind of, I think, chasing after the demographic shift. And I have to say the market is always chasing, it looks like, after something that's already happening and isn't necessarily anticipating the next wave. So that's been part of the problem here. And it looks like, oh, great, there's all these single adults and they're getting jobs and they have some income and they're not married yet with children. Let's build all sorts of high density housing with smaller units near like where they want to be, downtown, the college, those kinds of things. And then when they are actually looking for that home, because maybe a little later than we used to be, lots of people are still getting married, deciding to have a family, and they're looking for a home. And if you're in Minneapolis, typically you start saying, I still want to live in the city, and you look and you look and you're outbid and you're outbid and you're outbid, and you end up finding something in an inner ring suburb or somewhere outside the city because that's what you can afford to start your family. I will say there's many families that are young families that are finding homes in the city that they can afford and buy. They are generally the wealthier families, and the middle class, working class families that used to be able to afford a house in the city and to raise their family are being pushed out by the patterns.
Well, I'd like to share another graph that I think is related to some of what you just brought up there, Councilmember Gordon, which is that we do in fact see in the data that crowding and overhousing exist in tandem, and that it's because of the income inequality that you mentioned, which is that what we're seeing is that a demographic trend that I didn't show in the graph is that the boomers are living longer and that they control most of the housing wealth in the United States. And so what we see, across, regardless of the actual like cost of housing, whether it's a low cost market or a high cost market, what we're seeing across cities is that there are many older households that have a lot of excess space in their home. So these are, that's defined as when there's less than one person per bedroom in the house. And we see at the same time that younger households, and especially households with kids, are living in crowded conditions in which there are more than two people per bedroom. So that's what we see on this graph here. And so it sounds like this is happening in Minneapolis. And Ed, would you say this is comparable to the situation that you described in New York as well?
100%. It goes back to what I was saying before. In fact, you have, households who are now looking for, a flight to quality, looking for better housing accommodations, but the newer product is smaller, but yet their households continue to grow. So, you're seeing households that are, three family, three individuals. So, um, so it's become even much more of a challenge as you grow and you're getting priced out if you're trying to look for a house that's next to impossible to begin with. So you're looking for options with apartments, and the newer apartment options are typically much smaller than what you would be comfortable with as your families grow. So it certainly is a challenge in New York. You see bits of that issue even in Boston. And a lot of the major cities are encountering this challenge.
Ed, what strikes you as sort of the first and most logical either policy or market solution to this current paradox of crowding and overhousing existing in tandem?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think the biggest challenge is it all starts off with what can be financed. So we have to kind of talk about what are the sort of the drivers for the choices that developers make. And so often developers and investors are kind of driven to acquire and build and rehab properties that basically are what I like to think have the path of least resistance. So oftentimes our clients tell us that if a property can be relatively financed well, if it can provide or prove a healthy cash flow, kind of what Cam had mentioned earlier, and is kind of zoned as of right, it can be built right away. There are a number of cities that are trying to push for better inclusionary zoning options to accommodate for affordable housing. There are developers who are trying to configure and find ways to offset the cost for construction, trying to get innovative and creative, looking at everything from mass timber to modular construction, trying to work with cities to work on the conveyance of city-owned properties. There are a number of these sort of solutions to offset some of those challenges. But if any of these are not quite in place as you need, if you're looking to develop to sort of address this solution, you have to factor in sort of the time. And time is a big factor. And for a lot of developers, there's a cost associated with the projects that they're dealing with and trying to get off the ground. So within that time, if it's going to take longer to kind of fight for rezoning, if it's going to take longer to find the sort of the lender that can work with you, even though there are a number of mission-driven lenders, many of them oversubscribed in a number of instances, and in other cases, if you're applying for tax credits, there's the application process, and you have to apply and hopefully win. But if you don't win, you have to wait perhaps another year, and you have to find other ways to allocate resources towards your project. So there's a time factor that makes things relatively a challenge. So I think the biggest part of this has to come from a multiple set of angles. So I think it's cities such as Minneapolis who are working to improve and work on ways to provide better zoning options. I think it's and finding ways to kind of incentivize the development such that there's better opportunities to develop for what's needed and to develop it so it's as of right. I also think that we've seen sort of a gradual sort of decrease in the amount of tax credits that have become available. So I think there remains to be a challenge, but this is such an important piece of what helps to build and drive the affordable housing market in this country. So I think it's just sort of it's a combination between the public sector, continuing to encourage for better growth and for better design, and I think it's also trying to continue to encourage for those resources for funding and financing that can accommodate that. So I think it comes from both the public and private side to continue to acknowledge that these resources are needed. And again, as I had mentioned as well, I think having to think about ways to reduce or offset that cost, either working with cities on the conveyance of property and working on negotiating prices in such a way through RFPs. We need to continue with those efforts. It's helpful. But I also think that there are other ways within mitigating and reducing costs that we're going to have to be forced to drive to look at in order to ensure that we can finance development.
All right,
succinctly.
I hear three key takeaways so far, and Ed, jump in and correct me if I'm wrong. First key takeaway I hear is the problem that we see here is real. There really is a
Yes.
miss. This is crowding and overhousing exist in tandem. We really do have a mismatch between demand and supply right now. This is really going on, and it's going on in a
Right.
variety of market contexts. This
That's
isn't
right.
just confined to New York City. Second thing I hear is that part of the reason that we have this problem is that solving this problem is not the most profitable thing that market
Right.
developers can be doing right now. And uh, there's a variety of reasons why it's not the most profitable thing, but that is the reality. And so we need to think about how to incentivize the market to work on this problem. But number three, also that part of the reason the market is not working on solving this problem is because it's hard, in part because of regulatory barriers. And so the public sector needs to work on those regulatory barriers as well. Those were the takeaways that I've heard from Ed and Camp so far. Let's dive a little bit more into the data and see if we can uncover some more takeaways. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about these questions already. I think that we have this bigger question that we need to talk about, specifically how to build for low-income families. Let's put a pin in that and come back. I'd like to interrogate a little bit more the problems that we've talked about so far. That they are challenging, but it seems like you guys are both fully aware of these. This is not news to you. The findings that I'm sharing. So, what's it going to take in order to actually start working on some solutions for this? Cam, Minneapolis has done some exciting things. How did you guys start rolling this boulder downhill?
Well, it certainly has been challenging, and I could go on and on at length about what we've done. I think it really helped in Minneapolis when we had to do our comprehensive plan again, and we, instead of doing it quietly like we had done in the past and making a few tweaks there, we decided to open up the process broadly and look at what was going on in the development in our city and try to have an honest discussion within the city as a whole, which turned out to be full of controversy and issues. It did just happen to occur at the same time when we were seeing work in other areas, especially work around addressing climate change and work around addressing racial inequities. So we had a couple of non-government university projects, one called Mapping Prejudice, which was really significant, which was kind of looking at the history of housing and development in the city of Minneapolis. And that really helped open up people's minds to maybe some of the historic injustices. We have had a very segregated housing market here. We have had zoning laws that were in place that were very restrictive. When those were lifted, we ended up having a system of racial covenants that were put on properties that were sold. We had redlining, and people, I'm sure, are familiar with the bigger picture of national investments and help and assistance with housing for some and not for others, and what happened with that. But telling that story really helped open people's minds. We also were able to talk a lot about just the kind of the persistent racial inequities in our city that are certainly tied to income inequities in terms of where there are gaps from everything to lifespan to birth weights to graduation rates, you name it, including home ownership and including asset building. We also look in the recent past to the foreclosure crisis that hit our city so hard and saw where it was hurting the most, and it was in those traditionally poor areas with concentrations of people of color. So that was significant and really helped us open it up. I think I really appreciate the comments about regulatory barriers and hurdles, but that's a real trick to figure out what ones to actually open up, because when you're in government and you're concerned about the public welfare and the public good, you have to look well beyond where the profits are and where the money is. And often we see the housing market itself failing dismally. And so we don't want to err on the side of opening up for anything can happen. You guys go and have fun and make a fortune, because that doesn't get the right results either. So we've tried to open up parts of our city. Our biggest fight was whether we could add density to our traditional single family home areas, and we were able to do that. And that was kind of removing a regulatory barrier, or I think, as Ed said, allowing development by right, to simplify it a little bit. And we're still working on all of those rules, but I think that's significant, and I can talk more about that later. I can talk more about other things too. I don't want to spend the whole time um, here. I do really appreciate the comment you made that I think of as something about the empty nester problem, because we do have people who want to stay in their neighborhoods, but their families have grown up in a large, unwieldy home, and so we've also been trying to add incentives, and some of those are for how can we help add incentives where the needs are, or set goals where the needs are, and we've been able to make a little bit of inroads in terms of getting more senior oriented and desirable kinds of housing in more neighborhoods in our city. Maybe I'll leave it
You
there
know,
for
Cam,
now.
that's a great point, and that's another kind of innovative solution that, yeah, I feel like I don't hear enough about. The need for new housing product and new housing inventory in the right places so that seniors can age in place without house hoarding. That is extremely helpful. I've also gotten a couple questions in the chat to clarify how crowding was defined in that previous graph. I just want to let folks know that the data source for that is the American Community Survey. This is easy stuff to look up. That graph is from a piece written by my colleague, Jenny Schutz. The link is in the slides. And crowding in that graph is defined as more than 2 people per bedroom in the household. Okay, so Cam, you brought up the market, the housing market, and housing developers, having fun and making a lot of money. So now I'd like to talk about how persistent racial and land use segregation are in the United States, and some of what's gone on with that trend over the last 70 years. So what I'm showing on this graph is how the spatial scale of segregation has gradually increased over time, and that while cities, primary cities, city centers have in large part either stagnated or shrunk, our metropolitan regions at the same time have grown dramatically through a combination of population leaving center cities and moving to the suburbs, and also new growth happening in the suburbs. And so there's also been you mentioned redlining, and the history of racist practices in lending. And so what we see is that there's a really stark racial disparity in terms of how this population shift has played out. And in the graph on the right on this slide, I'm showing Minneapolis, and we see that while in 1950, both the city of Minneapolis and its region were pretty close to 100% white, that even as the city and the region have diversified, the bulk of that growth has been concentrated in the suburbs and not in the city of Minneapolis. And that's a trend that we see in a lot of cities nationwide. This trend looks slightly different in the West. But this is a dynamic that's played out in lots of places. The end result of which is that even as the country as a whole has become much more diverse, our neighborhoods have not become more diverse, and the average neighborhood is still the average white neighborhood is still 71% white today. So I would like to hear from both Ed and Cam, and Cam, let's start with you just to follow up on your previous comments. Is this just a natural market outcome of what's happened with the way that we've regulated growth? Or is this an outcome that was engineered?
Well, it could be a combination. Not sure what natural means in this instance, but maybe there is a tendency for the market to go to how they can maximize their profits. And if that's a natural market outcome, maybe that happened as well. But it also was clearly engineered, and we talked about lending practices, and I talked a little bit even about racial covenants, and even where real estate folks are pushing things. I'm not sure how aware folks are about the racial covenants, but there were developers in the 20s, I think, in the 30s, who decided the way to market their new developments was to put these restrictive covenants so people could think they were going to be moving into an area that would be preserved as being for white folks. And they're pretty clear and pretty stark if you actually read what's in those. They're now all illegal, and in the 60s we passed fair housing laws and all of those things. But what happened is most of those places by then in the city were developed and built up and already set. And we have had persistent segregated community. And in the region, it's the same thing. And it's been very challenging. How do you integrate our community better and do that? I think there has been engineering. You can even trace it to when the interstate freeways were put in. So the interstates were put in, and in the city of Minneapolis, and I know and suspect in major cities across the country, they were put in historically black and brown neighborhoods. In St. Paul, we lost the Rondo neighborhood, which was a predominantly African American neighborhood, and it was thriving. It had a business section, and that's where Interstate 94 went through. And the same thing happened with 35W going through South Minneapolis in the center of the city, and then right through North Minneapolis as well. So this was seen then. This is this was urban renewal, they called it, and a great opportunity. And so we ended up just perpetuating it and also isolating some neighborhoods and cutting them off from each other, and perpetuated that. And I think that was engineered. And incidentally, once you had the freeways, wow, that was really easy. Then I'll just hop on my freeway and I'll get out to the suburbs. And we had builders out there just going crazy, building more and more houses in the suburbs and having this massive urban sprawl. We even experienced white flight, I would say, in the city of Minneapolis when I was growing up. And so it was engineered to a large extent, which makes me think maybe we can re-engineer something better.
And Ed, I'd also like to get your reactions here. One thing that strikes me in particular when I look at these graphs is I see, how we've gone from a situation where cities like Minneapolis that used to be majority white, we now see that the vast majority of the white population in the Minneapolis region and in the U.S. as a whole lives in suburbs. And while and this is something that's really shifted the politics of who and what the city is for. So I'm interested in how you think this plays out in terms of the real estate as a business.
It's kind of interesting. I think one of the interesting points that was brought up by Cam, I think talking about sort of recreating, sort of re-engineering things to a certain degree, is part of what the real estate industry tends to try to find ways to do. So that even includes this challenge of sort of segregated communities. So one of the ways in which that is being done is actually through developments that would be eligible for some form of public funding, such as new market tax credits to support charter schools. There's an interesting piece about how you can see that if public schools are failing in some of these areas, there's oftentimes a developer who will look to say, well, we have an interest in getting the incentives that are necessary to develop some form of mixed income or workforce housing. We're waiting on tax credits to develop affordable housing, but the schools in this area are not so great. And just even going back to this whole conversation, I think part of the flight in many cases for these families is trying to find the best place to raise children. And oftentimes the schools are sort of the marker for that. And sadly, in a number of major cities, the public school systems are not performing as well as parents would want them to. And then there have been many great cases where charter schools have been sort of the response to that. And there are also cases where charter schools have not performed well. And there are actually studies that show that, if not of anything, if the charter school is rated well in terms of the academic performance, land values improve. And in other cases where if it's not so great or if it's comparable to the public schools around it, then land values actually stay around the same, or in some cases have even shown some level of slight decline. But the point being is that I think by looking at re-engineering these communities, I think it starts with, and there's a comment that Andre Perry made yesterday, which is that we have to, before we can really invest in assets, we have to invest in people. So I really think a big part of this conversation about value is valuing people and ensuring that you value their lives. And by valuing their lives, you value their mind. And I think that's one of the more important things that comes from ways in which we can really think more about how you want to see an area improve. I think it starts in many cases with the schools. And you won't have to add new highways or anything else if you actually invest in those communities at the ground level. In addition to that, add community centers or other ways to keep kids engaged after school, keep them off the streets, find other ways for even public-private partnerships to support public and open spaces. All of these things have thus proven to show some level of improving value along the way. So these are the conversations we need to continue to have, because those are the most productive ways that we can really see ways that we can re-engineer these communities.
So, Ed, what I'm hearing you suggest is that there is a connection between both and kind of incentives and motivation on the supply side that's tied to how kinds and quality of services that are provided by jurisdictions. You're specifically raising education, and so I'd like to go back to Cam, just in his background, his personal background in education. Cam, is what Ed's saying resonating with you?
Well, yes, I'm not quite sure about the charter school as saving everything, though. So that was,
Sure, sure.
but I think that what we really need is communities that are thriving and have all the support systems that they need. We talk about that broadly in Minneapolis sometimes when we talk about complete neighborhoods. And actually, people really want to be in walkable communities now, and they want to have thriving options of what they could do to get their needs met and also to pursue their interests and their careers. And so that's why we're seeing a lot of people coming back to cities. And they don't want to necessarily be in the suburbs if there's an opportunity to be in a city. So we've seen a reversal in Minneapolis in recent years, including our downtown, which now is growing in population. I will say during COVID, there was some people who left downtown and not necessarily the rest of the city, because of course downtown got less exciting when there were no shows and no restaurants and those kinds of things. But I'm confident that we'll be bouncing back, and we're seeing downtown neighborhoods kind of growing. And so then the question is, how do you make sure that they have grocery stores, that they have parks, that they have good schools for their families? So absolutely, that's the role that government gets to play and be a great partner in too. I have great infrastructure. They want good streets or bike paths. What about transit? How are you providing affordable transit that can help people get around? And then maybe how do you put some pressure to make sure that those communities do have some kind of economic variety in terms of incomes of the residents, because that's always challenging. So we did pass an inclusionary zoning ordinance where we want to see some more affordable housing. We've got a property tax break in our state that if you get a little bit of assistance from a local government and you commit to keeping your units affordable, you pay a lower rate in property taxes, and that's been a big plus for us. And it's also allowed us to then the help we give them sometimes is an energy assessment, help them get some green energy investments in their buildings, and that also keeps the utility costs down for them too, which is great. But I think that that's a really good point. I think as long as we can have healthy neighborhoods with clean air, with all the resources, and we're especially investing in our youth in terms of recreation and schools, that's fantastic. I'd say we need to put a big investment directly into the public school systems that we already have operating in our cities and make sure they have the resources that they have. And sometimes they compete with the charter schools and it's not really on a fair footing. So that's a more complicated discussion, but generally in the concept, absolutely.
I really hate to change the subject, but I want us to also return to something that Cam mentioned earlier in this conversation about the foreclosure crisis, and specifically how that impacted Minneapolis. And I'd like to share just a couple more graphs about that, if I can subject you guys to just, I promise, one last set of graphs. So let's skip ahead here. What I'm showing on this graph is homeownership trends from the turn of the century to 2018. So this is all prior to the pandemic. And so what we see is that while homeownership was growing in the United States as a whole during that time, it was growing to a lesser extent in Minneapolis. And in some other cities, there was actually a dramatic erosion of homeownership during this time. And then I want to unpack this exact same graph a little bit more to show how in different places we've seen really different trends when we break down homeownership and single out Black homeowners and compare their trends to all other homeowners. And so once again, we see that while both Black homeownership and all homeownership were growing in the United States during this time period, that in Minneapolis, Black homeownership declined while all other homeownership increased. And that so we can see that what we see in this graph as a small increase in overall homeownership in Minneapolis, what that actually represented was some healthy growth in homeownership overall, but which was then really reduced by this dramatic erosion in Black homeownership. And so if we then look at this small percentage decline in terms of the Black share of decline in homeownership, what that actually represents in real terms is a 40% decline in the Black homeownership rate in Minneapolis in that almost 20-year period. So, Councilmember Gordon, you shared with me some material that has been part of your conversations about what's happening in Minneapolis neighborhoods and with Minneapolis housing. And I was particularly struck by these two parallel headlines about what's been going on in Minneapolis in the last generation. And so I'll leave this one up where we can go back to the last graph. But I'm interested to hear from both you, Councilmember Gordon. We'll start there, and then we'll go to Ed to talk about what is behind this fairly dramatic change in terms of homeownership realities in U.S. cities in the last 20 years. Councilmember Gordon, let's start with you.
So yeah, this is horrendous, and I think we were hiding our heads in the sand for a long time. So maybe it's even been longer than 20 years, but we've seen this decline, and I think the decline happened because of subprime lending. The short-term decline. There were some inroads being made, but there's pretty clear evidence now that the lending market was taking advantage, and it's I guess I don't have the expertise to quite understand all of what was going on, but it's hard not to say there was some either implicit or explicit racism that was happening here. So somebody would want to buy a home maybe in a poorer part of town, and maybe they appeared to be a higher risk, so their interest rate was much higher, and so they'd be paying much more, and they were getting these subprime, and either they were getting a loan maybe that somebody even knew was going to be really hard to pay off, but at least they could get a bunch of money off of them in the meantime. But especially when there was a crisis, and so the economy and some kind of downturn made it much harder. So I think that accounts for some of that short-term loss. And we saw in Minneapolis that the subprime loans were targeted very specifically to the neighborhoods where there was a concentration of Black, Indigenous people of color. So that was going on there. We also spent decades not looking at it. So when I first took office in 2006, we were tracking a lot of statistics about what a great city we were, how our unemployment rate was low, how home ownership was going well, how people were healthy, and we weren't parsing it apart to look at how it's different in different parts of the city or for different races. And so that was kind of the white lie, because we would look really good when we'd say, look at our unemployment rate, it's great. And then when we divided the demographics and said, wait a minute, it's really, really great if you're white, and it's 3 times less great if you're Black. So there was these disparities, and it's obviously something that's been structural, institutionalized, baked into the system. So if you're not really looking for it and you're not aware, you won't notice it. So the big story is we're looking at it and we started looking at it. I'd still like to go back to Wells Fargo and collect our due for all those subprime lending that happened and all the horrible outcomes that people in North Minneapolis experienced when their homes were foreclosed on because of it. But I don't know that we still can sue them. But so maybe government also let us down because we weren't being good enough watchdog to keep track of this. But I'd suggest that the system we have now, the way the housing market is, and maybe it's improved a little bit. I'll just put in one more complaint since I'm on a rampage here. We also didn't get much help when the federal government wanted to fix the foreclosure crisis either. They decided the solution was to bail out the banks and help the investors so that they were taken care of. And we didn't have money reaching back to help these people get back in their homes.
I'll just pull this graph back up here. I see a question in the chat about these data. So this is a graph that I made. A source, once again, is linked in the slides. But just to let people know right now, in this case, this refers specifically to these municipal jurisdictions, to these city boundaries. These are not regional graphs. These are municipal graphs. Ed, would you like to chime in response to anything that Cam said, or do you have your own reaction to this graph? I know that you've worked at a big bank, and I know you didn't do personal consumer lending to homeowners,
Right.
But I'm curious about whether you have any insights about how this happened and what to do about it.
Well, it kind of ties into a lot of the work that we see now. And I think back to when I had even first started my career, I think we saw, from the late 90s to a certain degree up and through now, multiple pockets of gentrification across the country. And I think that kind of starts with new investment or new opportunities for areas to be rezoned. And in some cases, if it's being rezoned to then accommodate for a higher density, but the developers who are building market rate or luxury units, in some of these primarily Black and brown communities, we've seen if you wanted to potentially buy either a condo, or if you're looking to perhaps own a home in that area, that the cost already increased. And if you're already not quite earning at a certain income where you'd be at a place to qualify for the loans that are going to be that have to be priced for a now higher housing price, then you already are priced out even as the area is beginning to change. And then for certain Black and brown families, you might have had the opportunity to inherit a home, but as the taxes increase from home values increasing, you see new assessments, and those assessments come with higher taxes. And if you don't have the income to even pay the taxes, you're already going to find yourself in a bit of a challenge. So again, it's been among some of those issues that we've seen in a number of cities where gentrification has kind of picked up. And what's also really fascinating is that you've probably seen a number of reports about appraisals and sort of the inherent bias. So you have certain families from underrepresented backgrounds who are actually trying to maybe refinance their home, trying to do the right things, trying to take out a certain portion of cash based on the value that's been created in their home, and yet their values are not being hit to where they should be. Where market should kind of tell you that their home should be worth maybe $650,000, but an appraiser for some reason in a neighborhood that is relatively competitive, or maybe even mixed race, for example, but somehow for some reason is told their home is worth $450,000. And this happens on a number of different occasions. And then there have been sort of investigations where you've found that these same homeowners have went for a second opinion to only then remove items from their home that resemble anything that shows that they are a person of color, only to see the values rise. So we have perception issues on top of the sort of market-driven decisions that have led to some of these values, kind of taking a number of folks out of the market altogether. And so it's unfortunate. It's very sickening in many cases. But those are some of the dynamics that I've certainly seen at play, and we certainly need to work to remedy that.
Could I add one more thing?
Yeah. Oh,
just
yes, please, Councilmember Gordon.
So just the result of what happened with this when the foreclosure happened, and I don't really know if these numbers all came from that necessarily, But is that those properties then that were foreclosed on were sold, and they were sold for pretty cheap. And we had some pretty major buyers from outside the city come in and pick them up for rental property. So they were basically taken out of the home ownership potential for people to go back and build wealth in as well. And so now we're kind of wrestling with that, and how can we create programs and some kind of regulation so that people in the neighborhoods have a chance to buy their homes, and build that wealth again. Somebody asked about the generational impact, and it could be very, very significant. We have people in Minneapolis who are able to buy their homes when racial covenants were in place, whose offspring still own those homes in the city. So that generational wealth is significant, but also when you sell your home when you're older. And so that has been stripped away from some of these families, and they don't have that. And I'm not sure how much wealth was built up, of course, when they were foreclosed on. But now they're taken out of that home ownership market, and that's a challenge. And we see that a lot in cities where certain things are popular and are making money, like rental property. So that's what gets built, and that's what gets things turned into, or maybe hotels sometimes, and sometimes it's ownership in some neighborhoods. But it's a problem, and it's a lingering problem from the foreclosure crisis we're still dealing with now. Thanks, and I'll turn it back to you, Tracy.
I think I'm frozen. Should I refresh this page?
Okay, apologies for those technical issues. Just keeping an eye on time, I am actually going to spare you guys the last set of graphs that I was going to subject you to, and I'd like to skip ahead to talking a little bit more about the future. Given that we just had a question about how this is going to impact, how everything that we've seen so far is going to impact future generations. So we've just looked at a bunch of long-term trends that don't look like they're changing. Just in your daily practice, both of you are engaged every day in working on what's happening in the housing market. Can you share with our audience today a little bit about what you do see that is changing in your own practice and in the people that you're working with? Ed, let's start with you.
I do see some changes, and it goes back to the point I was making earlier when we first started. In spite of the fact that the average size of households has sort of decreased, or that square footage, a couple of things we are seeing is that especially after the pandemic, there has been a push for developers to really begin to find ways to be a little bit more creative with floor plans to not only accommodate for better home office living arrangements, but also for those families where you're essential workers or you're on the front line, or coming from traditional blue collar backgrounds. How can we accommodate for these larger generational families that are living within these confined spaces? So the groups that we work with are sort of attuned to those challenges. They are looking to find ways to find the cost so they can build out for more 3-bedroom units in certain markets where they know that that's going to be sort of a demand and a requirement in order for certain families to live comfortably. Some of the other things that we're seeing even across in other cities, which I think are part of the good solution, is that you're seeing things like housing trust funds being used to assist residents living below the poverty line. That's something that is happening in Chicago. Certain rental subsidy programs. We're working with certain investors who are very community development focused, who are trying to find properties within underrepresented communities, multifamily projects, 200 units, give or take, where they know there's a big demand for housing vouchers. And, that can be used as a benefit, especially if those vouchers have not been applied to to other developments or other properties within those areas. That actually can get certain lenders comfortable knowing that a certain percentage of the tenants are going to have that part of their income covered, and that can kind of help with any concerns with the rest of the market that would be filling in that space. So the groups that we work with are trying to use some of those sort of levers to provide some level of immediate solutions for the existing housing stock. So amongst the sort of community-minded investors, these are some of the things that we are seeing. And I think for the naturally occurring or existing properties that we see in the market, we need to see more of that. And one thing that I think we talked about before this panel was the use of security deposit funds, which is a major barrier, and I can get into that a little later. But I think that in itself is just part of the thinking that we've seen that's been helpful to kind of combat these challenges in terms of the price and the cost to build and construct. That's sort of structurally the things that I think are helpful and are part of the conversation we need to keep having. We need to continue to be creative along those lines, and it's great to have some clients who are using that in the assets that they're looking to acquire.
And Councilmember Gordon, what about you? Where are you seeing change in your work?
Well, I think there's been a lot of dramatic change in recent years, especially. I think one of the things we've been able to do is open up policies where there was much more restrictive in the past. We now allow up to triplexes on any lot in the city. We also allow more missing middle-sized housing in more parts of the city than we did before. We're trying to make it easier and clearer where you can put development along transit corridors and commercial areas with our 2040 plan. And we also used to have a lot more resistance to where a shelter could open up or where supportive housing could open up. And I think people in the city generally, but also in city government, have taken major strides recently to open that up. We had something in our code that wouldn't let unrelated people live together too. And for a while, we created a pathway out of that if you declared yourself as an intentional community. But now we've taken relatedness out of the picture. So if the home is safe and has safe bedrooms and passes the fire code for a certain number of people, they don't have to be a family anymore, which has created a lot of, I think, nice options. We've also allowed accessory dwelling units. We kind of stepped into it it had to be owner occupied at first, and I just recently was successful in opening that up. So if there's space, accessory dwelling units can open anywhere. The 2040 plan really was significant. There's 100 policies in there. A lot of them have to do with housing. We also passed our inclusionary zoning policy with that, which it probably doesn't go that far. We're working on some pretty innovative things right now, like a tenant opportunity to purchase an ordinance. And if you can imagine what I was just saying about those homes in North Minneapolis, well, this passes, that might give an opportunity for that renter in that home to make a bona fide offer on the house when it goes up for sale and get to keep it. We've also are creating some community preference policies so that when we're putting city money into projects, we give points and preference to something that will actually serve people who are living there already. Because some of our policies have been promoting displacement and gentrification, and we're trying to reverse that. So I think there's lots of innovative things going on. We're also right on the cusp of passing a single room occupancy ordinance. This might be striking to some folks out there, but we didn't allow new rooming houses in the city since the 60s. They banned them because of some bad track record of so-called flop houses. Now we're going to start allowing those again, and that could create a really affordable option. We'll see what actually happens and what the market does with it. But kind of opening things up and getting out of the way is a part of that. We're also putting more money than ever into affordable housing, and we have a trust fund, so we're creating that incentive. We're also doing a lot more for this naturally occurring affordable housing. I mentioned giving them a property tax credit and helping them that way, trying to preserve what we have now and allow space for new ones. We've seen some really innovative things come into some of the neighborhoods already that didn't take any city money either. They come in at a little below market rate.
That's very exciting. So, Kim, I feel like you kind of already answered this question in terms of talking about the new policies that you're looking at on the Minneapolis City Council. But Ed, I also want to ask you on the capital side, on the private capital side, and with the other municipal clients that you work with, is there one solution that you wish you could just implement today?
That I could implement today. I think one I'd like to see more funding going into, I think is love to see more funding going around sort of these sort of security deposit gaps and challenges that people have. I mean, this is one of the largest barriers to folks who are already rent burdened in a number of cities. And there are certain nonprofits, such as one in DC, the Lotus Campaign, that works to provide that funding to incentivize landlords. I think we need to see a little bit more of that. And then even on the tech side, there's a startup, I think their name is Rhino. They've actually come up with a platform to also offset that cost where you're paying that deposit on a monthly level in exchange for them to almost ensure that your deposit is there. So for as little as 10 to 14 bucks a month or something to that degree. Again, I think we need to look at some of these sort of prescriptive measures that can help folks who are just trying to find ways to navigate, as well as find opportunities to incentivize landlords to take the plunge and to become a little more flexible with folks coming from some of these income constrained backgrounds. So a lot more along those sides, I think, can help certain populations out. So I feel like those are some of the key sort of suggestions that need to be expanded further at the public level, and then again on the private side, coming up with the mechanisms to move it.
So I
Ed, I
did
love
have
that
one more I
idea.
was saving, Tracy, for this answer.
Oh,
Could I
shoot.
just have
Let's
30
have it.
seconds? All right.
Yes.
I think one thing that we could do, and if I could implement it immediately, would be to remediate the interstate highway system in our cities. I think if we put lids on the freeways and allowed development to occur there and green space, took out some of our ramps, it would have an amazing impact. The freeways took out thousands and thousands of housing units out of our city. And just imagine if we could come back and bring those back, and burying those freeways is pretty easy in Minneapolis because they're already in the deep trenches. And I bet they're easy in your community too. And if we talk about it, we'll get closer to being there.
Cam, I love your vision. Um, Cam and Ed, I'd like to just thank you both for your time and your insights today. I will say, Cam, after this conversation, I don't think I will ever hear the phrase "white lie" and think the same thing again. I have goosebumps and I'm changed forever. And Ed, I really appreciate your insights today. I think that it's easy to forget that in the United States, there's no shortage of capital, but there is a major shortage of the right connections between capital and the projects that need to happen. And so, thank you so much for your insights about that today. I know we're holding everyone up from the networking break. So, with that, I'll just say that you can find myself, Ed, and Cam on Twitter to continue this conversation. And I look forward to meeting Cam and Ed. I'd love to see you guys in person, ideally in Minneapolis,
These
when
days.
we are ready to hit the detonation button on a highway on ramp. Thank you so much for
It was
your
a
time.
pleasure.
Thank you.
Appreciate it, guys.